He sat in the same booth every morning for 30 years, corner table by the window, black coffee, no sugar. The waitresses knew his order, the cook saved him the fresh biscuits, but nobody knew his name. Just the quiet man from table 7. What they didn't know was that he wasn't waiting for breakfast. He was waiting for someone who would never come. Until the day a young Marine walked in, saw the faded photo on his table, and everything changed forever. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful tale of waiting, loyalty, and unexpected closure, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe some stories deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button. These moments matter. The Sunrise Diner sat on the edge of Millfield, Texas, where the highway met the town limits. Red vinyl booths, checkerboard floors, and the smell of bacon that never quite left the air. It opened at 5 a.m. sharp, and by 5:15, the regulars had claimed their spots. Truckers heading east, factory workers starting early shifts, and in the corner booth by the window, the man everyone called Henry. Henry Martinez arrived every morning at 5:30. Never earlier, never later. He wore the same clothes, pressed khakis, a white button-down shirt, and a brown leather jacket that had seen better decades. His hair was silver, combed neat, and his hands carried the kind of steady calm that only came from years of discipline. He'd nod to Martha, the head waitress, order black coffee and wheat toast, then settle into his booth with a folded newspaper he never quite finished reading. But it wasn't the newspaper that held his attention. It was the photograph. Every morning, he'd place it gently beside his coffee cup. A worn, creased picture of two young Marines in dress blues, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning like they owned the world. One was clearly Henry, 40 years younger, face unlined by time or worry. The other was broader, taller, with kind eyes and a smile that seemed to light up the entire frame. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Henry and Tommy, Paris Island, 1985, brothers always." For 30 years, Henry had placed that photo on the table. For 30 years, he'd glanced toward the door between sips of coffee. For 30 years, he'd waited for someone who would never walk through it. The regulars had theories. Martha thought maybe it was his son, lost in Iraq or Afghanistan. Bill, the cook, figured it was a brother who'd moved away and lost touch. The younger waitresses whispered that it might be a lost love, though the photo clearly showed two Marines, not a couple. Nobody asked. Small towns had rules about privacy, especially when it came to grief that had been carried quietly for decades. What they didn't know was the real story. What they couldn't see was the weight Henry carried every morning, the reason he never ordered more than he could finish quickly, the explanation for why he always sat facing the door. Tommy Reeves had been more than Henry's battle buddy. He'd been the brother Henry never had, the friend who'd pulled him through boot camp when Henry thought he couldn't make it, the Marine who'd saved his life in Lebanon and then joked about it like it was nothing. They'd served together for 8 years, planned to retire together, maybe start a security business back in Texas where they'd both grown up. But on March 15th, 1993, during their last deployment in Somalia, Tommy had volunteered for a reconnaissance mission that went wrong. His unit was ambushed. Radio contact was lost. When the rescue team finally reached the site, they found evidence of a firefight but no bodies. Tommy Reeves was listed as missing in action, presumed dead. Henry had requested to stay and search. His commanding officer denied the request. Henry had written letters to every congressman in Texas demanding extended search operations. The letters were filed away. Henry had used his own leave time to fly back to Somalia and hire local guides to search areas the military wouldn't cover. He found nothing. The Marine Corps held a memorial service. Henry attended, but he never accepted the folded flag. Instead, he made a promise. If Tommy was alive, if he'd somehow survived and was trying to make it home, Henry would be waiting for him. Every morning, in the place they had always talked about meeting when the service was over, the Sunrise Diner in Millfield, the town halfway between their childhood homes. 30 years later, Henry was still waiting. The waitresses changed over the years. Martha had been there the longest, 22 years, but even she didn't know the full story. She'd tried asking once, gently, about the photograph. Henry had smiled, touched the picture lightly, and said only, "A friend. A good friend." The conversation had ended there, and Martha never pressed again. But she noticed things. The way Henry's eyes would lift every time the door chimed. The way he'd straighten slightly whenever footsteps approached his booth. The way he'd always leave exact change, never lingering long enough to miss someone who might be looking for him. After 2 decades of serving him coffee, Martha knew the signs of a man keeping a promise. The younger staff found Henry mysterious, maybe even a little sad. Some of the college girls who worked summers thought he was sweet, this old man who never caused trouble and always said please and thank you. But they didn't understand the discipline it took to show up every single day for 30 years. They didn't recognize the military bearing that never quite left a man's shoulders, even in civilian clothes. Henry never talked about his service. If someone thanked him for it, and in a town like Millfield people noticed the way he carried himself, he'd nod once and change the subject. He didn't want recognition. He didn't need stories or sympathy. He just needed to be where he'd promised to be, when he'd promised to be there. The years blurred together. Henry watched the diner renovate twice, seen 3 owners come and go, observed the town grow from a truck stop into a suburb as Austin expanded eastward. Young families moved in, coffee shops opened, the highway added an extra lane. But every morning, Henry sat in the same booth with the same photograph, drinking the same coffee. Some mornings were harder than others. Veterans Day always found him quieter than usual, staring longer at the picture. The anniversary of Tommy's disappearance, March 15th, was the only day Henry ordered 2 cups of coffee, leaving one untouched on the opposite side of the table. Martha never asked about the second cup. She just brought it, black, no sugar, the way Tommy would have wanted it. Henry's neighbors knew him as the polite man who kept his lawn trimmed and never played his television too loud. His mail carrier knew him as the customer who always had his box cleared by noon. The pharmacist knew him as the patient who filled his prescriptions exactly on time and never complained about prices. But none of them knew about the morning ritual. None of them understood that Henry's entire day was built around those 2 hours in the diner, from 5:30 to 7:30, when hope and memory sat beside each other in a worn vinyl booth. By 2023, Henry was 78 years old. His hands shook slightly when he lifted his coffee cup, and the walk from his truck to the diner door took a little longer than it used to. Martha worried about him sometimes, especially in winter when the parking lot was icy. She'd started watching for his headlights and unlocking the door early if she saw him coming. "You don't have to do that," Henry would tell her, but Martha would wave him off. After 22 years of serving someone, you earn the right to worry about them. On a Tuesday morning in October, something changed. Henry arrived at his usual time, ordered his usual coffee, and settled into his usual booth. But as he reached for the photograph, the same ritual he'd performed over 10,000 times, his hand stopped. For just a moment, he stared at the picture without picking it up. His shoulders, always straight, seemed to sag slightly. Martha noticed from behind the counter. In all her years of watching Henry's morning routine, she'd never seen him hesitate. She brought his coffee over personally instead of letting Jenny, the new girl, handle it. "Everything okay this morning, Henry?" she asked gently. Henry looked up at her, and for the first time in 2 decades, Martha saw something different in his eyes. Not sadness, that had always been there, quiet and controlled. This was something else. Acceptance, maybe, or exhaustion. "I'm fine, Martha, thank you." His voice was steady, but quieter than usual. Martha lingered for a moment, wanting to say something more, but not knowing what. Finally, she patted his shoulder lightly, the first time she'd ever touched him, and walked back to the counter. Henry picked up the photograph then, held it a little longer than usual, and whispered something too soft for anyone to hear. Then he placed it back on the table, exactly where it always went, and opened his newspaper. At 7:30, as he did every morning, Henry left exact change on the table and walked toward the door. But instead of his usual nod to Martha, he stopped at the counter. "Martha," he said, "I want you to know, I appreciate everything. All these years, you've been very kind." Martha smiled, but something in his tone made her chest tighten. "Of course, Henry. See you tomorrow?" Henry paused, hand on the door handle. "Tomorrow," he said finally, and walked out. But the next morning, at 5:30 a.m., Henry's truck didn't pull into the parking lot. Martha watched the door until 6 a.m., then until 6:30. By 7 a.m., she was worried enough to call the police. By 8 o'clock, Officer Rebecca Santos was knocking on Henry's front door. Henry answered, still in his pajamas and robe, looking confused but alert. "Everything all right, sir?" Officer Santos asked. "Martha at the Sunrise Diner was concerned when you didn't show up this morning." Henry blinked, processing the question. Then something shifted in his expression. "What day is it?" "Wednesday, October 18th, sir." Henry nodded slowly. "I overslept." "I never oversleep." Officer Santos studied his face. She'd been a cop for 12 years and knew the difference between confusion and something deeper. "Would you like me to drive you to the diner, Mr. Martinez?" "No," Henry said quietly. "No, I think maybe it's time." "Time for what, sir?" Henry looked past her, toward the street that led to the diner. "Time to stop waiting." That afternoon, Martha received a phone call. Henry's voice was steady, but she could hear the weight behind his words. "Martha, I won't be coming in tomorrow, or, well, I won't be coming in anymore." "Henry, what's wrong? Are you sick?" "No, ma'am, I'm just tired, and I think Tommy would understand." Martha felt tears she didn't expect. "Henry, that picture you always carry. Want to tell me about him?" For a long moment the line was quiet. Then Henry began to speak, and for the first time in 30 years, he told someone the whole story. About Tommy Reeves, about Somalia, about the promise he'd made and kept for 3 decades, about mornings when hope felt impossible but showing up felt necessary, about the weight of waiting and the fear of giving up. When he finished, Martha was crying openly. "You're a good man, Henry Martinez," she said. "The best kind of friend anyone could ask for." "I tried to be," Henry replied. "I really tried." The next morning, the Sunrise Diner felt different. Martha kept glancing toward the corner booth, expecting to see Henry's familiar figure. Other regulars noticed, too. Bill the cook asked twice where the quiet guy was. Even customers who'd never spoken to Henry seemed to sense that something was missing. "My name is Staff Sergeant Michael Reeves," he said. "Tommy Reeves was my grandfather." The coffee cup slipped from Martha's hands and shattered on the floor. Michael continued, his voice gentle but determined. "He died in a VA hospital in Phoenix 2 weeks ago. He'd been there for years, with severe PTSD and memory loss from his injuries in Somalia. But before he passed, he had moments of clarity, and in one of them, he told me about Henry Martinez, about a promise they'd made, about a diner in Millfield where Henry would be waiting." Martha sat down heavily on a stool behind the counter. "Tommy's dead?" "Yes, ma'am, has been since 2019. But he never forgot Henry. Even when he couldn't remember his own name, he'd talk about his friend who was waiting for him at the Sunrise Diner. He made me promise to find Henry and tell him thank you for waiting, for not giving up, for being the kind of friend who keeps a promise even when hope is gone." The diner had gone completely quiet. Every customer, every employee was listening to a story they'd never heard but somehow always known was there. "Where is Henry now?" Michael asked. Martha wiped her eyes with her apron. "He's at home. He stopped coming yesterday. Said he was tired of waiting." Michael nodded, understanding more than his years should have allowed. "Can you give me his address?" I think grandfather would want me to finish what he couldn't." An hour later, Henry opened his front door to find a young Marine standing on his porch. For a moment, Henry just stared, his hand gripping the doorframe for support. "Sir," Michael said, "I'm Michael Reeves. Tommy Reeves was my grandfather." Henry's knees nearly buckled. "Tommy? He died 2 weeks ago, sir. But he never stopped thinking about you, about the promise you made, about mornings at the Sunrise Diner." Michael held out the photograph. He kept this his whole life. Even when he couldn't remember anything else, he remembered you. Henry took the picture with shaking hands, his eyes filled with tears he'd held back for 30 years. "He's really gone?" Henry whispered. "Yes, sir. But he wanted you to know. You kept your promise. Every single day for 30 years, you kept your promise. And he knew. Somehow, he knew." Henry sank into a chair on his porch, the photograph pressed against his chest. Michael sat beside him, and together they talked about Tommy Reeves, the grandfather Michael had barely known, and the friend Henry had never stopped missing. They talked until sunset, sharing stories that bridged decades and connected 2 generations through the love of one extraordinary man. And when Michael finally stood to leave, he placed something in Henry's hands. It was Tommy's dog tags, worn smooth by time and worry. "He wanted you to have these," Michael said. "He said you'd understand what they meant." Henry closed his fingers around the metal tags and felt the weight of 30 years lift from his shoulders. For the first time since 1993, he wasn't waiting anymore. The promise was kept. The friend was honored. The vigil could finally end. The next morning, Martha arrived at the Sunrise Diner to find Henry sitting in his usual booth. But this time, he wasn't alone. Michael sat across from him, 2 cups of coffee between them, and the photograph placed where both men could see it. "2 breakfasts this morning?" Martha asked, barely containing her joy. Henry looked up at her and smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him in 22 years. "2 breakfasts," he confirmed, "1 for me and 1 for Tommy's grandson." "We have a lot of catching up to do." And so began a new chapter. Not of waiting, but of remembering. Not of hoping for what might be, but of celebrating what was. 2 generations brought together by the power of a promise kept and the love of a man who'd never truly been forgotten. Henry continued coming to the Sunrise Diner, but now he brought stories instead of silence. Michael visited whenever his leave allowed, and together they created new memories built on the foundation of old ones. The corner booth became a place of healing instead of hoping, of connection instead of solitude. Some promises are kept in grand gestures, others are kept in quiet moments, repeated daily for decades, witnessed only by those who serve coffee and sweep floors and understand that faithfulness doesn't need an audience. Henry Martinez kept his promise for 30 years, not knowing if it mattered, not certain it would ever be acknowledged. But promises aren't kept for recognition. They're kept because some bonds transcend time, distance, and even death itself. And sometimes, if you're faithful long enough, the waiting ends not with the person you expected, but with exactly the person you needed.